Captain Marcus Reed watched the warning lights flash across his ship's control panel as the alien vessels surrounded him. His small scout ship had been running silent through the Outer Rim territories when the Corvani patrol found him. The Reptilian. Aliens had been expanding their empire for decades, and humans were definitely not welcome in their space. The communications system crackled to life with harsh alien words that his translator struggled to process. The voice was cold and commanding, speaking in the guttural language of the Corvani Empire. Marcus had studied their culture during his training, but hearing it firsthand sent chills down his spine. "Human vessel, you have violated sacred Corvani territory," the voice announced through the speakers. "Your ship will be disabled and you will be taken for judgment." Marcus tried to maneuver his ship away from the alien fleet, but 3 massive Corvani warships had already positioned themselves around him. Their weapons charged with an ominous blue glow, and he knew his small vessel stood no chance against their firepower. The hull shuddered as energy beams struck his engines, sending sparks flying from the control panels. Within minutes, his ship was dead in space. The life support systems flickered and died, leaving only emergency power running through the cramped cockpit. Marcus watched helplessly as a docking tube extended from the nearest Corvani vessel and attached to his ship's hull with a metallic clang. The airlock hissed open, and 4 Corvani soldiers entered his ship. They were tall, muscular beings covered in dark green scales that gleamed under the emergency lighting. Their eyes were yellow and cold, and their faces showed no emotion as they pointed their weapons at him. Each soldier wore heavy armor that made them look even more intimidating. "Come with us, human," one of them said in broken English. "General Thizes wants to see you." Marcus raised his hand slowly and followed the soldiers through the docking tube into the Corvani ship. The corridors were dark and humid, designed for beings who preferred warmer temperatures than humans. Strange alien symbols covered the walls, and the air had a metallic taste that made his nose wrinkle. The soldiers led him through several levels of the ship until they reached a large chamber filled with other Corvani officers. At the center of the room stood a massive figure wearing elaborate armor decorated with glowing symbols. This had to be General Thizes, the commander of this fleet. General Thizes was even larger than the other Corvani, with darker scales and scars covering his arms and face. His yellow eyes studied Marcus with obvious disgust, as if he was looking at something unpleasant that had crawled out from under a rock. "So this is a human," General Thizes said, his voice deep and rumbling. "You look even more pathetic than our reports suggested." Marcus remained silent, knowing that anything he said would probably make his situation worse. The general walked around him slowly, examining him like a scientist studying a new specimen. "Your species thinks it can explore our territory without consequences," the general continued. "You believe your primitive technology gives you the right to trespass in sacred space." The other officers in the chamber made sounds that Marcus assumed were laughter. Their scaled faces showed amusement at his predicament, and he could feel their hatred radiating from them like heat from a fire. "I have decided your fate, human," General Thizes announced. "You will be placed in our special holding cell where you can experience the full hospitality of the Corvani Empire." The officers made more of their laughing sounds, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. He had heard stories about Corvani prisons, and none of them had happy endings. 2 guards grabbed his arms and dragged him deeper into the ship. The corridors became even darker and more twisted as they descended into the lower levels. Strange sounds echoed from behind sealed doors, and Marcus tried not to think about what creatures might be making those noises. Finally, they arrived at a massive circular chamber with a single cell in the center. The cell was surrounded by thick energy barriers, and Marcus could see observation windows positioned around the walls. Whatever was inside that cell, the Corvani wanted to watch it very carefully. "Behold the Draconis chamber," one of the guards said with obvious pleasure. "Home to 3 of our most dangerous predators." Marcus looked through the energy barrier and saw 3 enormous shapes moving in the shadows. The creatures were huge, easily the size of small buildings, with scales that seemed to absorb light. Their eyes glowed like red coals in the darkness, and their breathing created clouds of steam in the cold air. The Draconis beasts have been hungry for many days, the guard continued. They will enjoy having fresh meat to play with. The energy barrier flickered and died, creating an opening just large enough for a human to pass through. The guard shoved Marcus forward, and he stumbled into the cell. Behind him, the barrier snapped back to life, trapping him inside with the three massive creatures. The cell was much larger than it had appeared from outside, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness high above. The floor was covered with old bones and metal scraps, evidence of previous meals. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else that Marcus couldn't identify. The three dragons turned their attention to him, and Marcus felt their intelligence behind those glowing eyes. These weren't just simple predators. There was something more complex in their gaze, something that reminded him of the creatures he had known on New Terra. One of the dragons stepped forward, its massive head lowering to examine the small human who had been thrown into their domain. Its breath was hot against Marcus's face, and he could see rows of teeth that could easily tear him apart, but Marcus didn't run or scream. Instead, he stood perfectly still and looked directly into the dragon's eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that neither the Corvani nor the dragons had expected. The observation windows filled with Corvani faces as the aliens watched and waited for the show to begin. They expected blood and screaming, but Marcus had other plans. He slowly sat down on the cold floor and began making soft clicking sounds with his tongue. The dragons paused, their heads tilting as they listened to the strange human making sounds they had never heard before. In the observation windows, the Corvani officers looked confused and irritated that their entertainment was not proceeding as planned. Marcus continued making the clicking sounds, his eyes never leaving the largest dragon. He was about to find out if his years of training with similar creatures would be enough to keep him alive in this alien prison. The largest dragon moved closer to Marcus, its massive form casting shadows across the cell floor. The creature's head was enormous, easily twice the size of Marcus's entire body, with scales that seemed to shift color in the dim light. Its breathing created small clouds of steam that drifted around the human sitting calmly on the ground. Marcus continued making the soft clicking sounds, varying the rhythm and tone based on what he remembered from his time on New Terra, the dragon colony there had taught him that these creatures communicated through complex patterns of sounds, gestures, and body language. If these Draconis beasts were similar to the Terran drakes he had known, they might understand what he was trying to do. The dragon's head tilted to one side, and Marcus saw something change in its glowing red eyes. The aggressive posture began to shift, and the creature's breathing became less harsh. It was working. The dragon was actually listening to him and trying to understand the sounds he was making. The other two dragons moved closer, forming a loose circle around Marcus. Their movements were cautious but curious rather than threatening. Marcus could feel their intelligence as they studied him, trying to figure out what this strange human was attempting to communicate. In the observation windows, the Corvani officers were becoming agitated. General Vyzes had expected the human to be dead within minutes, but instead he was sitting peacefully surrounded by three of the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. Several officers were arguing in their harsh language, pointing at the scene below and making angry gestures. Marcus slowly raised his hand, palm open and fingers spread. It was a gesture of peace that had worked with the Terran drakes, showing that he had no weapons and meant no harm. The largest dragon studied his hand for a moment, then lowered its head until its massive snout was just inches from Marcus's palm. The dragon's breath was warm against his skin, and Marcus could feel the power contained within that enormous body. One wrong move and the creature could end his life in an instant, but something told him that wasn't going to happen. There was intelligence in those eyes, and intelligence could be reasoned with. Marcus began making different sounds, softer and more melodic than the clicking noises. These were comfort sounds, the kind that mother drakes made to calm their young. The dragon's eyes widened, and it made a low, rumbling sound deep in its chest that vibrated through the floor of the cell. The sound was answered by the other two dragons, who began making their own rumbling noises. Marcus realized they were trying to communicate with him, using their own language to respond to his attempts at contact. He had broken through the initial barrier, but now he needed to establish real communication. Over the next several hours, Marcus worked patiently with the 3 dragons. He learned that each one had a different personality and preferred different types of sounds. The largest dragon, which he began thinking of as leader, was cautious but intelligent. The second dragon was more playful and curious, while the third seemed angry and suspicious of everything. Marcus discovered that the dragons had been kept in this cell for years, fed barely enough to keep them alive and used as entertainment for important Corvani visitors. They had been isolated from their own kind and treated as nothing more than weapons or decorations. The anger in the third dragon's eyes made perfect sense now. As the hours passed, Marcus began to understand more about these creatures. They were not just predators or simple animals. They had complex thoughts and emotions, memories of better times, and a deep sadness that came from years of captivity. The Corvani had taken intelligent beings and turned them into prisoners for their own amusement. The dragons began to trust Marcus more as he showed them respect and patience. They allowed him to move closer, and eventually the largest dragon permitted him to touch its scaled hide. The scales were warm and smooth, and Marcus could feel the creature's heartbeat through the thick skin. General Vises appeared at one of the observation windows, his yellow eyes blazing with fury. He shouted orders in the Corvani language, and several guards appeared with energy weapons pointed at the cell. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. The general was not happy with how his entertainment was proceeding. The dragons sensed the threat and moved protectively around Marcus. The largest dragon placed its massive body between the human and the observation windows, while the other 2 flanked him on either side. Their peaceful behavior changed instantly to aggressive posturing as they prepared to defend their new friend. Marcus realized that he had achieved something remarkable. In just a few hours, he had gained the trust and protection of 3 creatures that the Corvani Empire considered their most dangerous prisoners. But he also understood that this was just the beginning. The dragons had been through years of abuse and neglect, and it would take time to fully heal the damage that had been done to them. The guards outside the cell seemed uncertain about what to do. They had weapons that could probably kill the dragons, but using them would mean destroying valuable assets that the Corvani had spent considerable resources to capture and maintain. General Vises was clearly weighing his options, trying to decide whether to eliminate the problem or find another solution. Marcus continued working with the dragons, teaching them simple gestures and sounds while learning their own methods of communication. He discovered that they had been deliberately kept separated from each other for most of their captivity, only brought together for special occasions when the Corvani wanted to display their power to visitors. The dragons were hungry for contact with others who understood them. They had been starved not just of food but of companionship and respect. Marcus provided both, and they responded by sharing their own knowledge and experiences with him. As the day wore on, Marcus learned that the dragons knew far more about the Corvani ship than their captors realized. They had been moved through different parts of the vessel over the years, and their excellent memories had recorded every detail of the ship's layout and security systems. They knew about hidden passages, weak points in the hull, and the locations of important equipment. The dragons also revealed that they were not the only intelligent species being held prisoner by the Corvani. There were other creatures scattered throughout the ship, all being used as weapons or entertainment by the Reptilian Empire. Some had been captured recently, while others had been prisoners for decades. Marcus began to see the full scope of what the Corvani were doing. They weren't just expanding their territory through military conquest. They were collecting intelligent species from across the galaxy and using them as tools to further their empire's goals. The dragons were just the most visible example of a much larger system of slavery and exploitation. As night fell in the ship's artificial cycle, Marcus sat surrounded by his 3 new companions. The dragons had arranged themselves around him in a protective circle, their massive bodies creating a warm shelter in the cold cell. For the first time since his capture, Marcus felt truly safe, but he also knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger challenge. The dragons trusted him now, but they were still prisoners. And somewhere in the depths of the ship, other intelligent beings were suffering the same fate. Marcus began to form a plan that would change everything. Days passed in the Draconis chamber, and Marcus established a routine with his 3 companions. He had given them names based on their personalities, though he kept these names to himself. Leader was the largest and most thoughtful dragon always, considering situations carefully before acting. Swift was smaller and more energetic, with bright scales that seemed to shimmer when excited. Scar was the most damaged by captivity, with old wounds on his hide and a deep mistrust of everything around him. The dragons had begun teaching Marcus their own language, a complex system of sounds, gestures, and even scent markers that conveyed detailed information. Marcus discovered that their intelligence was far greater than he had initially realized. They had been observing their captors for years, learning Corvani behavior, patterns, and recording every detail of their prison ship. The Corvani guards continued to throw scraps of rotten meat into the cell twice a day, barely enough to keep the dragons alive. Marcus watched his companions struggle with hunger and malnutrition, their once magnificent forms growing thinner with each passing day. The poor diet was clearly designed to keep them weak and manageable, but it was also slowly killing them. When the next feeding time arrived, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of allowing the dragons to fight over the meager scraps, he positioned himself between them and the food. The guards outside the cell watched in confusion as the human gestured for the dragons to stay back. Marcus picked up one of the rotting pieces of meat and held it up toward the observation windows. He shook his head firmly and threw the meat against the energy barrier, where it splattered and fell to the floor. The message was clear. He was rejecting the food as inadequate. The dragons understood immediately what he was doing. They moved to stand behind him, adding their own sounds of protest to his gesture. Leader made a deep rumbling sound that seemed to shake the entire cell. While Swift and Scar displayed their wings in a show of unified defiance, General Theises appeared at the observation window within minutes. His scaled face twisted with anger. He shouted orders in the Corvani language, and several guards entered the chamber outside the cell. They carried larger weapons this time, clearly intending to force compliance through intimidation, but Marcus stood his ground and the dragons remained behind him. He had learned enough of their language to understand that they were asking him to be careful, but they were also expressing their willingness to support whatever he was trying to accomplish. The bond between them had grown stronger than the Corvani had expected. The standoff continued for hours. More Corvani officers arrived to observe the situation, and Marcus could hear heated arguments taking place outside the cell. Some wanted to use force to restore order, while others seemed concerned about damaging their valuable prisoners. Finally, a compromise was reached. The guards brought fresh meat instead of the usual rotten scraps, though still not enough to properly feed 3 massive dragons. Marcus examined the food carefully, then nodded his acceptance. It was a small victory, but it established an important principle. The dragons would not be starved into submission as long as he was there to protect them. Over the following days, Marcus continued to push for better conditions. He refused to allow the dragons to eat food that was too small or too poor in quality. Each time, he faced down the guards and officers, using his growing influence with the dragons to force concessions from their captors. The dragons began to regain some of their strength as their diet improved. Leader's scales became brighter, and Swift started displaying more of the playful behavior that Marcus suspected was natural for his species. Even Scar showed signs of improvement, though he remained wary of any Corvani who came near the cell. As the dragon's physical condition improved, Marcus began teaching them more complex concepts. He showed them basic tactical formations, using gestures and sounds to coordinate their movements. The dragons were quick learners, and soon they could position themselves anywhere. In the cell, with just a few simple signals from Marcus, the Corvani observers became increasingly agitated as they watched these training sessions. They had expected the human to be dead within hours, but instead he was organizing their prisoners into a more effective unit. General Theises spent more and more time at the observation windows, studying the impossible scene below. Marcus learned that the dragons had been deliberately separated for most of their captivity because the Corvani feared what might happen if they worked together. The three creatures came from different parts of their homeworld and had never met before being imprisoned, but they were developing a strong bond based on their shared experiences and their mutual respect for the human who had treated them with dignity. The dragons shared their knowledge of the ship's layout with Marcus, using their complex language to describe areas they had seen during their years of captivity. They told him about the locations of other prisoners, the positions of important equipment, and the patterns of guard rotations. Marcus absorbed every detail, filing the information away for future use. Swift revealed that there were other dragons being held in different parts of the ship, though they were kept in smaller cells and were in even worse condition than the three in the Draconis chamber. Some had been used in gladiatorial contests for the entertainment of high-ranking Corvani, while others were being trained as weapons for use in military operations. Scar shared darker knowledge about the ship's true purpose. The Corvani were not just collecting intelligent species for their own use. They were preparing for a major offensive against several worlds, including human colonies in the Outer Rim. The dragons and other prisoners were meant to be deployed as shock troops in these attacks. Marcus realized that his capture had been more than just bad luck. The Corvani were actively seeking humans to study, trying to understand their capabilities and weaknesses before launching their offensive. His presence on the ship was part of a larger intelligence gathering operation. As the days passed, Marcus noticed changes in the dragons beyond their improved physical condition. They were becoming more confident and assertive, no longer cowering. When Corvani guards approached the cell, they stood taller, moved with more purpose, and showed increasing signs of their natural intelligence and dignity. The transformation was not lost on the Corvani observers. Reports began reaching General Theises about unusual behavior among other prisoners throughout the ship. The dragons in different cells were becoming more active, and some of the other intelligent species were showing signs of increased organization and cooperation. Marcus suspected that the dragons were somehow communicating with their fellow prisoners, sharing information about the human who had shown them respect and the possibility of resistance. The network of intelligent beings throughout the ship was beginning to wake up from years of despair and submission. General Theises finally decided to take action. He ordered additional security measures around the Draconis chamber and began making plans to separate Marcus from the dragons. The human had become too dangerous to leave alone with the prisoners, and the general was starting to realize that he had made a serious mistake, but Marcus was already several steps ahead. The dragons had taught him about the ship's internal communication systems, and he had been quietly gathering intelligence that would be invaluable to human forces. His neural implants were recording everything, and the information was being stored in ways that the Corvani couldn't detect. As he sat surrounded by his three companions on what he knew might be his last night in the Draconis chamber, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction. He had accomplished far more than he had ever hoped when he first entered the cell. The dragons were no longer broken prisoners but proud beings, ready to reclaim their dignity. The bond between them had grown into something powerful and dangerous, something that would soon change the fate of everyone aboard the Corvani ship. Marcus closed his eyes and began making the soft clicking sounds that had first gained the dragon's attention. Tomorrow everything would change. Marcus woke to the sound of increased activity outside the Draconis chamber. The usual quiet of the ship's night cycle had been replaced by the heavy footsteps of guards and the harsh voices of Corvani officers giving orders. Through the observation windows, he could see more personnel than usual gathering in the outer chamber, their weapons ready and their expressions tense. Leader lifted his massive head and made a low warning sound, alerting the other dragons to the danger. Swift and Scar moved into defensive positions around Marcus, their bodies creating a protective barrier between him and the observation windows. The dragons had learned to read Corvani body language over their years of captivity, and they could sense that something significant was about to happen. General Vyses entered the outer chamber, flanked by his senior officers and a squad of heavily armed guards. His yellow eyes fixed on Marcus with undisguised hatred as he approached the energy barrier that separated them. The general's scaled hands clenched into fists, and his breathing was harsh with barely controlled anger. "Human, General," Vyses said, his voice carrying clearly through the cell's communication system. "You have caused considerable disruption to the order of this ship." Marcus stood slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. The dragons remained in their protective positions but showed no signs of immediate aggression. Years of training had taught Marcus how to read dangerous situations, and he could feel the tension building toward a breaking point. "Your species is even more cunning than our intelligence report suggested," the general continued. "But your games end today. You will be separated from these creatures and placed in solitary confinement until we reach our destination." Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized his time was running out. The information he had gathered was too valuable to lose, and the dragons deserved better than to be returned to their previous state of abuse and neglect. It was time to reveal the truth about his mission and capabilities. "General," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady, "I think there are some things you should know about me before you make any decisions you might regret." The general's eyes narrowed, and several of his officers exchanged glances. They had expected pleading or defiance, not this quiet confidence. From a prisoner who should have been terrified, Marcus activated his neural implants with a thought, accessing systems that had been dormant since his capture. The implants were military-grade hardware, designed to be undetectable by most alien scanning technologies. They had been recording everything since his arrival on the ship, storing vast amounts of intelligence data that would be invaluable to human forces. "My name is Captain Marcus Raid of the Human Colonial Defense Force," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. "I am a reconnaissance operative on a classified intelligence mission." The Corvani officers began talking excitedly among themselves, their voices rising in pitch as they realized the implications of what Marcus was revealing. General Vyses raised a hand for silence, his face showing a mixture of anger and growing concern. "You claim to be a military spy," the general said, "but you were captured in a simple scout ship with no weapons or defenses. Your story lacks credibility." Marcus smiled, and the expression seemed to unnerve several of the watching officers. "My capture was part of the plan, General. How else could I gain access to your most secure facility and observe your operations firsthand?" The dragons around Marcus began making soft rumbling sounds, and he realized they understood more of the conversation than the Corvani suspected. Leader's eyes showed something that looked like approval, while Swift and Scar seemed excited by the revelation of their friend's true nature. "These neural implants have been recording everything since my arrival," Marcus continued, tapping his temple. "Ship layouts, security protocols, troop movements, and most importantly, the locations of your breeding facilities for intelligent species. The Human Defense Force is very interested in your methods of acquiring and maintaining prisoners." General Vyses stepped closer to the energy barrier, his massive form radiating menace. "Even if what you claim is true, the information will die with you. Your species will never receive your intelligence reports." "That's where you're wrong," Marcus replied. "The dragons have been teaching me things about this ship that you never imagined they knew. They understand your technology better than you realize, and they've been sharing their knowledge with me." As if responding to a signal, Leader moved to a section of the cell wall that looked identical to every other part of the surface. The dragon pressed his massive claw against what appeared to be solid metal, and a hidden panel slid open to reveal a complex array of conduits and control circuits. The Corvani officers gasped in shock and alarm. The panel was part of the ship's primary communication system, a section that should have been completely inaccessible from inside the cell. The dragons had known about it all along, but had never revealed their knowledge to their captors. "The dragons have been observing and learning for years," Marcus explained as Swift moved to another hidden panel on the opposite wall. "They know every system, every weak point, every secret pathway in this ship. They've been waiting for someone who could help them use that knowledge. Scar joined the other dragons at a third panel, and Marcus realized they were accessing the ship's internal communication network. The dragons had been planning this moment for a long time, waiting for the right opportunity to reveal their true capabilities. Impossible, General Lysis snarled. The Draconis beasts are animals. They lack the intelligence to understand complex technology. That's your first mistake, Marcus said. You assumed they were just animals because they looked different from you. Your second mistake was thinking that intelligence always expresses itself in ways you can recognize. The dragons worked with precision and coordination, their massive claws manipulating delicate controls with surprising dexterity. Lights began flashing on panels throughout the cell, and Marcus could hear the hum of power systems activating. Your third mistake, Marcus continued, was believing that keeping intelligent beings as prisoners would never have consequences. The dragons have been sharing information with every other prisoner on this ship, building a network of resistance that you never suspected existed. Alarms began sounding throughout the ship as the dragons' manipulations triggered security systems. The lights in the outer chamber flickered, and several of the Corvani officers looked around nervously as they realized their ship was being compromised from within. The dragons know about the other species you've captured, Marcus revealed. They know about the breeding programs, the combat training, and the planned offensive against human colonies. They've been documenting everything, and now they're sharing that information with me. General Lysis drew his sidearm, a massive energy weapon designed for use against large targets. Enough of this deception. Guards, prepare to terminate all prisoners in the cell. But as the guards raised their weapons, Marcus felt a surge of confidence. The dragons had taught him one final secret about the ship's systems, something that would change everything. The Draconis chamber wasn't just a prison, it was a control center that the dragons had been secretly modifying for years. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Marcus said calmly. The dragons have been very busy during their captivity, and they've prepared a few surprises for anyone who tries to harm them. Leader made a deep rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire ship. It was answered by similar sounds from other parts of the vessel, as dragons in different cells responded to the call. The network of intelligent prisoners was awakening, and the Corvani were about to discover what happened when they underestimated the species they had enslaved. The energy barrier around the cell began to flicker and weaken as the dragon's modifications took effect. Marcus smiled as he realized the moment of truth had finally arrived. The Corvani Empire was about to learn why humans had earned a reputation as the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The energy barrier around the Draconis chamber flickered once more and then collapsed completely, leaving nothing between Marcus and the dragons except empty air. The Corvani guards raised their weapons, but before they could fire, the lights throughout the ship went out completely. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows across the outer chamber as the dragon's modifications took full effect. Leader let out a roar that shook the entire ship, and it was answered by similar roars from throughout the vessel. The sound of metal tearing and energy systems overloading echoed through the corridors as dragons and other cells broke free from their own prisons. The network of intelligent prisoners that had been building for years was finally activating. Marcus activated his neural implants fully, broadcasting the intelligence data he had gathered to predetermined coordinates in space. The information about Corvani ship layouts, breeding facilities, and military plans streamed out through the communication systems that the dragons had modified. Human forces would receive the data within minutes, giving them a decisive advantage in any future conflicts. General Lysis fired his energy weapon at the cell, but the blast was absorbed by defensive systems that the dragons had secretly installed. The weapon's energy was redirected through the ship's power grid, causing additional systems to fail throughout the vessel. The dragons had turned the Corvani's own technology against them. Swift leaped from the cell with incredible speed, landing among the Corvani guards before they could react. The dragon's movements were fluid and precise, no longer the clumsy actions of a starved prisoner, but the deadly grace of an apex predator. Several guards went down immediately, their weapons scattered across the floor. Scar followed Swift into the outer chamber, his years of anger and resentment finally finding an outlet. The dragon had been waiting for this moment, and his attacks were brutal and efficient. The Corvani who had tormented him for so long discovered that their prisoner had been holding back his true capabilities. Leader remained near Marcus, protecting the human while coordinating the escape through sounds and gestures that the other dragons understood perfectly. The largest dragon's intelligence was fully on display now, as he directed the actions of his companions with military precision. Marcus moved through the chaos toward the chamber's main exit, the dragons clearing a path for him through the panicking Corvani forces. The ship's corridors were filled with the sounds of battle as other intelligent prisoners throughout the vessel joined the uprising. The Corvani slaves were no longer content to remain in captivity. The group reached the ship's main corridor system, and Marcus was amazed by what he saw. Dragons of different sizes and colors were moving through the passages, some carrying other freed prisoners on their backs. The intelligence network that had been building in secret was now operating openly, with different species working together to escape their captors. A young dragon approached Leader and made a series of complex sounds that Marcus was beginning to understand. The message was clear: the prisoners had gained control of several key systems, but the Corvani were organizing a counterattack. They needed to reach the ship's docking bays before the enemy could regroup. Marcus found himself thinking tactically as the group moved through the ship. The dragon's knowledge of the vessel's layout was proving invaluable, but he also drew on his own military training to anticipate the Corvani response. They would try to seal off the docking bays and trap the prisoners in the ship's interior. The group reached a major intersection where several corridors met, and Marcus could see Corvani forces setting up defensive positions ahead. The enemy had heavy weapons and were preparing to make their stand at this choke point. A direct assault would be costly, but the dragons had other ideas. Leader made a sound that Marcus recognized as a tactical signal, and several of the other dragons disappeared into maintenance shafts that only they knew about. The Corvani had never bothered to map these passages because they assumed their prisoners were too large to use them, but the dragons had been exploring them for years. The attack came from above and behind as dragons emerged from hidden passages throughout the intersection. The Corvani forces found themselves surrounded by enemies they couldn't see coming, and their defensive positions became death traps. The battle was over within minutes. Marcus continued moving toward the docking bays, now accompanied by a growing crowd of freed prisoners. He saw species he had never encountered before, some humanoid and others completely alien, all united in their desire for freedom. The Corvani had been collecting intelligent beings from across the galaxy, but they had underestimated the power of that intelligence when it was turned against them. The ship's internal communication system crackled to life with General Tice's voice, speaking in the Corvani language. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. The general was ordering his forces to abandon their positions and evacuate the ship. The prisoners had one. Swift appeared at Marcus's side, carrying a Corvani communication device in his claws. The dragon had learned to operate alien technology during his captivity, and he was now using that knowledge to monitor enemy communications. The information he provided helped Marcus coordinate the escape more effectively. The group reached the docking bays to find that several small Corvani ships were already under the control of freed prisoners. Dragons were loading other species into the vessels, preparing for departure. The escape was becoming an organized evacuation as the prisoners worked together to ensure everyone's freedom. Marcus climbed aboard one of the captured ships, followed by Leader, Swift, and Scar. The three dragons had become more than just allies during their time together. They were now partners in a relationship that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. The bonds formed in the Draconis chamber would last far beyond their escape. As the captured ships departed from the Corvani vessel, Marcus activated his neural implants one final time. The intelligence he had gathered was already being transmitted to human forces, but he had one more message to send. The data included the locations of other Corvani prison ships and the details of their planned offensive against human colonies. The ship's sensors showed the Corveni vessel falling behind, its systems failing as the modifications made by the dragons continued to spread throughout the ship. General Theises would survive, but his reputation and his command were both ruined. The Corvani Empire had lost one of its most important assets and revealed their methods to their enemies. Marcus looked around the captured ship at the diverse group of freed prisoners, all working together despite their different origins and appearances. The dragons had taught him that intelligence and dignity existed in many forms, and that cooperation was more powerful than domination. The communication system activated, and Marcus heard a familiar voice speaking in English. Human forces had received his intelligence reports and were moving to intercept other Corvani vessels. The information provided by the dragons and other prisoners was already changing the course of the conflict. Leader made a soft sound that Marcus recognized as a question, and he realized the dragon was asking about their destination. The great creature had never known freedom as an adult, and the concept of choosing where to go was still new to him. "We're going home," Marcus said, placing his hand on the dragon's scaled hide. "All of us." "To a place where intelligence is respected, and different species work together instead of enslaving each other." The dragons made sounds of approval, and Marcus felt a deep satisfaction. The mission had been successful beyond his wildest expectations. Not only had he gathered vital intelligence about the Corvani Empire, but he had also liberated dozens of intelligent beings and gained some of the most powerful allies humanity had ever known. As the ship entered hyperspace, Marcus began planning for the future. The dragons would need time to adjust to freedom, and the other rescued species would require help finding new homes. But he was confident that the bonds forged in the Draconis chamber would prove strong enough to overcome any challenge. The Corvani Empire had made a fatal mistake when they underestimated the power of intelligence and cooperation. They had expected to use enslaved beings as weapons, but instead they had created a network of allies who would work together to ensure that no species would ever again suffer the fate they had endured. The galaxy would be a different place because of what had happened aboard that prison ship, and Marcus was proud to have played a part in that transformation.